Barron stared out of the small window of her bedroom, her hands resting idly on the worn wheels of her chair. The world outside was alive with muted chaos, children shouting as they raced bicycles down the street, a mother dragging her toddler out of a puddle, an old man tending to his garden with careful precision. The vividness of life beyond the glass felt like an alien world, one she had only ever observed, never truly entered. Her room was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock and the occasional rustle of the wind brushing against the windowpane. Books filled the shelves that lined the walls, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared. Journals stacked high on her desk were filled with scribbled verses, the only place she allowed her voice to truly exist. On the desk sat a notebook, open to a page she'd started hours earlier. Do the stars ever ache from loneliness? Or do they burn with the light of unshared dreams? Beneath them, I wonder if I will ever shine, or if my glow is destined to flicker unseen. Barron tapped the pen against the edge of the notebook, the rhythm syncing with the restless thoughts tumbling in her mind. She closed the notebook with a soft thud and sighed. Poetry was her escape, yet even it couldn't dull the persistent ache of emptiness. She wheeled herself toward the mirror across the room. The reflection staring back at her was one she had never quite made peace with. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes were framed by thick lashes, her black hair cascading over her shoulders in waves. To others, she might have been striking. To herself, she was incomplete, defined by the chair she sat in and the legs that had never again carried her since the accident. Her brother's voice called from downstairs. "Barron! Dinner's ready!" She hesitated, her hand lingering on the wheel. The warmth of her brother's support was both a comfort and a reminder of her dependence. Some days she wanted to join him, to be part of the family she so often distanced herself from. Other days, like today, she preferred her solitude. "I'll eat later," she called back, her voice soft but firm enough to carry. The sound of footsteps retreating told her he'd accepted her answer without question. He always did. She appreciated it and resented it in equal measure. The room darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon. Barron turned her chair toward the window once more, gazing up at the stars that blinked awake in the twilight. Somewhere deep inside, she carried a faint hope, buried beneath layers of fear and self-doubt. "What if?" she whispered aloud to no one but herself. "There's more to this life than watching it pass me by?" The stars offered no reply, but the question lingered in the quiet room like a spark waiting to catch fire. Barron's dreams often carried her back to that moment, the sunny afternoon when everything changed. She was 8 years old, running down the park's grassy hill with a kite dancing above her, her mother's voice echoing. "Slow down, Barron!" She hadn't slowed down. Not then. The memory shattered as quickly as it formed, replaced by the sensation of falling, her foot catching on a loose rock, the tumble, the sharp pain, and then the numbness. The hospital lights were blinding, the doctor's voices clinical and distant. "Spinal cord injury," one said. "Paralysis from the waist down." Her mother cried silently, holding her hand while Barron stared at the ceiling. She hadn't cried then, not understanding the weight of what she'd lost. The tears came later, on her first day back at school when the other kids whispered and pointed, when she couldn't join them on the swings, when a boy she liked avoided her eyes. She learned to build walls, retreating into books and the quiet safety of her room. The years passed, and the walls grew thicker. Now, sitting in her chair, the echoes of her childhood pressed heavily on her chest. She clenched her fists and whispered, "It shouldn't still hurt like this." But it did. She wheeled over to her desk and flipped open her journal, writing furiously. "The past is a shadow I cannot outrun. But perhaps I can learn to live beneath it." Barron tugged nervously at the hem of her sweater as her brother parked the car outside the community library. "You've got this," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. She nodded but didn't speak. Her stomach churned as she wheeled herself inside, the faint smell of old books wrapping around her like a blanket. The receptionist directed her to a small office where a woman in a crisp blouse sat behind a desk. "Barron Adams?" the woman asked, smiling politely. "Yes." The interview began, each question chipping away at Barron's confidence. What were her strengths? What experience did she have? Did she feel comfortable assisting patrons? Her answers felt stilted, her voice too soft. Toward the end, she noticed a young man shelving books in the corner of the room, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He glanced her way and gave her a warm, encouraging smile before returning to his task. The interviewer closed her folder and said, "Thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch soon." Barron wheeled herself out, her brother waiting by the door. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Fine," she said, though the word felt heavy in her mouth. As they drove home, her mind lingered on the kind smile from the man in the library. When Barron got the call offering her the position, she almost turned it down. But her brother's excitement and gentle encouragement pushed her to accept. Now, sitting behind the desk on her first day, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The library was quiet, save for the soft rustle of pages and the occasional beep of a scanner. Her job was straightforward, checking out books, organizing shelves, and helping patrons with questions. Still, the weight of being watched, or worse, pitted, made her uneasy. She struggled to reach a book on a high shelf, the wheelchair limiting her movement. Just as she was about to give up, a hand appeared beside hers, plucking the book effortlessly. "Here you go," said the young man from before, the one who had smiled at her during the interview. "Thanks," she mumbled, her cheeks flushing. "I'm Daniel," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "Barron. Nice to meet you, Barron." He hesitated, then added, "Let me know if you need help with anything. I'm around." She nodded, unsure how to respond. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks and fleeting interactions. As she left, Barron caught Daniel's gaze across the room. He gave her another smile, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. The weeks at the library blended together, each day a quiet rhythm of books, patrons, and the hum of soft conversation. Barron's nerves slowly eased, though she still found herself withdrawing when she could. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that people were always seeing her, always measuring her against some standard she could never meet. But Daniel was different. Every day, he'd offer a simple greeting or a helping hand when she needed it, like reaching for a book she couldn't quite grasp or bringing her a cup of coffee when he noticed she hadn't left her desk all morning. He never treated her with pity, never made her feel like an outsider. One afternoon, as she sorted through a stack of returned books, Daniel approached with a book in his hands. "You might like this," he said, handing it to her. Barron glanced at the title, The Outsider's Diary. "You think so? I've seen you reading a lot of poetry," he replied. "It's got some good stuff in it. I think you'd connect with it." She studied him for a moment, unsure of his intentions. But there was something about the way he spoke, casual but thoughtful, that made her feel like he was offering a genuine connection. "Thanks," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. From that day, their conversations grew easier. They talked about books, their favorite authors, and sometimes their lives outside the library. She learned Daniel had a stutter as a child and still struggled with it sometimes, though he spoke of it with a quiet grace, never using it as an excuse. Barron found herself laughing at his jokes, looking forward to their conversations, and even sharing bits of her poetry with him, though only when she was sure no one else was around. One evening, as they cleaned up after closing, Daniel handed her the book she had been reading. "So, what do you think?" Barron looked up, surprised by the question. She'd lost herself in the pages, so much so that she hadn't realized how much time had passed. "I liked it," she said softly. "It made me think about how we all live with some version of loneliness, you know?" Daniel's eyes softened, and he nodded. "Yeah, I get that." There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Barron could tell he wasn't rushing her to speak or share. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small but growing warmth in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. Daniel's invitation to the stargazing event caught Barron off guard. She wasn't one for crowds, not with her wheelchair, and she had never felt completely at ease in large groups. But there was something in Daniel's invitation that made her consider it, made her feel like this might be an opportunity to step outside of her walls. "You don't have to if you're not up for it," Daniel had said when she hesitated. "But it's going to be quiet and beautiful. Just some people from the library and a few others from the neighborhood. You'll have plenty of space." Barron had agreed, despite her nerves, and now, standing in the dark park with the cool night air brushing her face, she could feel the nervous flutter in her stomach. The small crowd gathered in a circle around a telescope, their chatter soft against the backdrop of crickets and the distant hum of city lights. As she wheeled herself over to the edge of the group, she caught Daniel's eye, and he smiled, waving her over. She rolled closer, feeling the warmth of his presence like a silent anchor in the sea of strangers. He introduced her to a few people, each conversation brief and polite, but she still felt out of place. The laughter around her seemed so natural, so effortless, and Barron felt herself shrinking under the weight of her own discomfort. But then Daniel leaned toward her. "Let's step aside," he suggested quietly. They moved a little further away, sitting on a grassy knoll that overlooked the small crowd. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, a canopy of stars so bright that it almost seemed unreal. "I'm glad you came," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying a hint of gratitude. "I almost didn't," Barron admitted. "But I'm glad I did, too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched the stars, their silence comfortable, as if the distance between them had shrunk in the quiet night air. Daniel broke the stillness. "You know, I used to think about the stars a lot when I was younger. Wondered if anyone else was looking at them the way I did." Barron turned toward him, curious. "What do you mean?" "It's just, sometimes I felt like I was on the outside of everything, you know? Like I was just this thing that people saw and didn't really understand." He paused, looking up at the sky. "But when I looked at the stars, it was like I wasn't alone. I didn't have to explain myself to them. They just were." Barron's breath caught in her chest. She felt that too. More than she cared to admit. The idea that someone else, in his own way, had experienced a version of what she'd felt her whole life was both comforting and unsettling. "I get that," she said quietly. There was something in the way Daniel spoke that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way that no one ever had before. In that moment, she didn't feel like she was trapped inside her chair. She felt like she was part of something bigger. The two of them sat in silence for a while longer, the stars above them burning brightly as they shared the quiet, unspoken understanding that sometimes, even the darkest night could hold a kind of beauty. Barron's life began to feel a little different after that night. She started making small but significant changes. She attended a poetry reading at a local cafe, something she'd always wanted to do but had never found the courage for. The atmosphere was welcoming, the audience respectful. She read one of her poems about the stars, about how even in darkness, there could be a quiet, steady light. At work, she began to speak up more, to offer her help without second-guessing herself. One afternoon, an elderly woman came in, struggling with the large stack of books she wanted to check out. Barron wheeled over, smiling warmly. "Can I help you with that?" she asked. The woman's eyes brightened, and she nodded, allowing Barron to assist her. "It's so nice of you to offer," the woman said with a smile. As Barron scanned the books, she realized the warmth wasn't just in the woman's appreciation, it was in her own heart. She hadn't felt like a burden in that moment. She hadn't felt invisible. When Daniel passed by, he gave her a small, approving nod, his eyes reflecting the quiet pride that she had done something so simple yet so significant. Later that evening, after work, Barron sat at her desk, the quiet of her room wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. She opened her journal and wrote, "I am more than the space I take up. I am the words I speak, the light I share. Perhaps, after all, I do have a place in this world." For the first time in a long while, she believed it. The library was quiet, just as it always was at the end of the day. Barron sat at her desk, organizing books, her mind distracted by the sound of murmured conversations and the soft rustle of pages turning. It had been a good day, one where she had felt like part of the team, like she belonged. She'd even shared a laugh with a patron who had come in for help finding a book on gardening. But then, just as she was starting to feel comfortable in her own skin, she overheard a conversation between two library patrons in the aisle next to her desk. "I don't know how she does it," one woman said in a low voice, not realizing how close Barron was. "I mean, how does she even get around? It must be so hard to live like that." The other woman's response was quieter, but Barron could still hear it. "I can't imagine. She must feel so isolated. People don't really understand what it's like for someone in a wheelchair." The words pierced Barron's chest like needles. They weren't said maliciously, but they were said without understanding, without empathy. And the worst part? She knew they were true. She had always felt like the world saw her as something to be pitied, something to be feared. The unspoken discomfort in people's eyes when they saw her in the chair was something she could never escape. Her hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. She felt the familiar, ugly flush of shame creep up her neck, her pulse quickening. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to feel like she was invisible, like her whole existence was reduced to the limitations of her body. But she couldn't escape the truth. She was different. That night, Barron didn't return Daniel's text asking if she was free to meet. Instead, she stayed in her room, shutting the door behind her, the silence pressing in from all sides. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror, couldn't look at the world outside her window. It was too much, and she wasn't sure how to fight it anymore. The next morning, Barron woke to the bright sunlight streaming through her curtains. She lay there for a moment, tangled in the sheets, staring up at the ceiling. She felt the weight of the night's thoughts still pressing on her chest, but she couldn't stay there forever. She had to face it. Taking a deep breath, she wheeled herself over to her desk and picked up her phone. She scrolled through the messages until she found Daniel's. "Hey, Barron. You okay?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. She could ignore him. She could close herself off. But something inside her, something fragile and hopeful, urged her to reply. "I'm sorry I didn't respond last night. I'm okay, just thinking a lot." She hesitated, then added, "Maybe we can meet today? I could use some company." She hit send before she could change her mind. An hour later, Daniel was at her door, his warm smile immediately melting the cold barrier Barron had erected around herself. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't pressure her to talk. He just sat with her, the two of them sharing quiet conversation over coffee in her small living room. "I went to the library yesterday," he said after a long silence. "And I heard you reading some of your poetry." Barron felt a flush rise in her cheeks, her words faltering. "Oh no. I didn't think anyone heard me. I was outside the door," Daniel admitted with a grin. "And it was beautiful. Really." She didn't know what to say. It felt strange to hear someone else speak so plainly about her work. But there was something in the sincerity of his voice that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. "You're not invisible, Barron," he said softly. "I hope you know that." Her throat tightened at his words. The truth hit her like a wave. She'd been running from herself for so long, hiding in the corners of her own mind, afraid of being judged. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to hide anymore. She smiled, a small but real smile, and nodded. "I know. It's just hard sometimes." Daniel reached over, his hand resting gently on hers. "I get it. But you don't have to do it alone." And for the first time in a long time, Barron believed him. Months passed, and the library became a place of comfort and connection for Barron. She spoke with more ease now, even laughing with the patrons who came in to browse. She had made peace with the fact that there would always be challenges, but she didn't have to face them in isolation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel invited her to join him for a stargazing event in the park. The same event that had sparked their deeper connection months earlier. Barron hesitated at first, as she had before. But when she looked up and saw Daniel's eager, warm gaze, she knew she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the stars, not of herself. She met him under the night sky, the same one that had once felt so distant. Together they sat side by side, sharing the quiet beauty of the stars overhead, the world around them alive with the sounds of life. I think I'm finally starting to understand, Barron said quietly, her voice full of wonder. That I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. I just have to be me. Daniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the stars. And that's more than enough. As Barron looked up at the sky, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. Beneath the stars, surrounded by the warmth of Daniel's presence, she had finally found a place where she could shine. And that, she realized, was all she needed. The stars burned brightly above them, as if echoing the quiet promise of a future that was no longer confined by the shadows of her past.